The Insanely Hopeful Profile Overview. Risky, but more upside, baby. Please review these important presentation disclosure before we proceed. The Informed Household analyzes 9 what we call funding profile types. And on these 2 dimensions, we look on the vertical, and that's really how you choose to save. And we have an icon that describes that. And on the horizontal, we're looking at where you're going to be spending your resources. So who are these insanely hopefuls, this particular household type? Well, these are households that prefer saving through investing, usually, price fluctuating assets, stocks, bonds, equities, that type of thing. They're prioritize most of their spending on essential living expenses. And the important third dimension is their success is really boils down to the level of fundedness that we measure via the funded ratio. So what's interesting about this particular group is this is by far the most common American household funding type. This has come about because in the last 30 years, defined benefit plans and stuff have gone away, and everybody is going the route of self-administrated retirement plans and 401ks and 403bs, where you're managing the assets yourself. And so that's led us, the bulk of America, so to speak, into at least pre-retirement America, into the world of investing. And frankly, given this is such a big cohort, this is what pretty much funds the whole investment management and, if you want to call it, money manager business. So they're in business because insanely hopefuls are looking for help from managing their assets. So a typical profile for this group will look like this. When you gather up all their assets together, the bulk of them are going to be in the current financial assets, real financial asset category, growth assets with some risk, versus human capital, which is, again, future savings, and social capital, which is more your pension type and your guaranteed income from Social Security. On the spending side, if you think about wants on the left and needs on the right, the bulk of the spending assigned has been on the essential cost side. So we're using primarily risky capital assets to fund essential living costs. So usually these types of households, and this is probably, again, pretty typical because this is the most common funding profile type, is they're heavily invested in equities, and usually in, again, the 401k plans and IRAs and stuff like that. They'll have some Social Security already. They'll have real assets too. The main thing is this group really values the flexibility of being able to control their assets, and that's important. But they also, as I find, often get confused about how much risk they're really taking on. Speaking of risk, this is our, again, big 5 buckets of risk categories, and we're going to look at them for the insanely hopefuls. So what do you think is the primary risk factor for this? Straight up, it's volatility risk or sequence risk. It's the issue of having, again, so many of their assets in risky growth assets. It's not that there's anything the matter with that, but you do need to be able to manage around the risk of holding stocks, bonds, and anything that can have a fluctuating asset price. The next set is usually longevity risk, the fear of kind of outliving your money, and what you can do for that. And we're going to talk about how you can mitigate some of that. And then thirdly, we would say liquidity risk. Again, all of the risk factors are there, but these are the ones that if you have just a limited amount of time and you're in this profile type, this is what you should be focusing on. Okay, this is a great example of volatility or sequence risk, courtesy of BlackRock. In their little scenario that they've drawn up here, you have 3 individuals starting out with $1 million each, taking a distribution of $60,000 a year, inflating that each year for inflation. So this is 25 years. And what's interesting, and then over here is these are the returns. And if you average out all these returns, it's 7% over the 25 years. So the point here is, if you happen to be the unlucky Mr. White scenario where the first 2 years were the bad years, it's very hard for portfolios to recover and then be able to continue what hoping to get the 60,000 years annually adjusted. So this shows you literally in this sequence, even though the average for all these is 7%, Mr. White runs out of money 2 years early, whereas Mrs. Doe, who had the good years early and then the bad years at the end, ended up literally with their principal intact and then a little extra. Mr. Rush, who had the level, 7% annually returns, which never happened in real life, still came out with some money left over at the end. But again, this is why timing is so critical, is when you start taking the withdrawals and stuff, what type of market environment we're in, because it really affects how much the portfolio is capable of producing in terms of steady income over the desired period. The next risk is longevity, and that affects your living expenses over time. So if you got an extra long lifespan, all these expenses to the right, get pushed out further to the right. And this is important too, because it may just be you having the extra longevity. What about your spouse, and vice versa? So unfortunately, not everyone goes on the same time schedule, obviously, because with mortality, and that's really important too. So even if you get a longer lifespan, is it going to be a quality in your later life? And in fact, if you look at the medical cost curve here, generally it tends to go up a little bit faster than inflation in the early retirement years, but at the end is when you tend to have the most of your expenses on the medical side, and that mainly affects your quality of life too. Those late in retirement years, you want them to be nice years, and then obviously thinking about if you're married, what's that going to be like for your surviving spouse. Finally, there's always liquidity risk, but in our model, one reason we're stringent about it, if we can get your fundedness or funded ratio over 1.2, the overfunded status, and it gives you a little bit of extra equity here, especially handy later in life to help fund the proper amount of liquidity. Because if you can picture the funnel in our picture of the lifestyle risk, the funnel keeps getting bigger the older you get. Part of that is because you have less time to recover if there's an unexpected expense shock or something you have to pay. So liquidity is always a factor, and we'll talk more about what the true liquidity should look like. So those are the three key lifestyle funding risk factors for the insanely hopefuls: volatility risk, longevity, and liquidity risk. For our subscribers, we provide a more detailed kind of how-to video on how to address those. So in summary, the key to life is kind of managing your risks effectively to make sure that you can live out your desired lifestyle. And when you're funding it, you want to know if your spending, assumptions or goals are reasonable, and whether the way you prefer to save is going to work for you, it's achievable, and you can measure all that with the funded ratio over time and really track your progress and stay on top of it. Here are some additional video tutorials if you want to learn more about the various terms we covered. And here's our contact information if you want to reach out by phone or email. By the way, I love the Warren Buffett quote here. Rule number 1, don't lose money. And rule number 2, don't forget rule number 1.